Good evening and welcome. Settle in, let go of the day, and allow your mind to drift. We are not going to journey into the realm of fiction, but into a story just as vast and far more transformative. It is the story of a single human life, and how that life patiently, meticulously, and almost reluctantly reshaped our understanding of existence itself. This is the story of a man who saw the world not as a finished masterpiece, but as a grand, unfolding process. A man of quiet habits, persistent illness, and profound curiosity. A man who took a simple 5-year voyage around the world and turned it into a 2-decade intellectual journey that would ultimately shake the foundations of science, faith, and our own human identity. Tonight, we travel back to the age of steam and candlelight, to the studies and shorelines of Charles Darwin. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Loved Beetles, 1809 to 1825. We begin not on a volcanic island, but in the green rolling hills of Shropshire, England. The year is 1809, and the world is in motion. Napoleon is redrawing the map of Europe, Beethoven is composing his Fifth Symphony, and the first tremors of the Industrial Revolution are being felt. On February 12th, in the town of Shrewsbury, a son is born into a life of remarkable privilege. His name is Charles Robert Darwin. His home, the Mount, is a large, comfortable brick house overlooking the River Severn. It is a place of order and intellectual rigor. His father, Dr. Robert Darwin, is a towering figure, both physically and socially. He is one of the most successful physicians in England, a man of imposing authority whose expectations for his children are as substantial as his reputation. Charles's mother, Susanna, daughter of the famed potter Josiah Wedgwood, is a gentle presence, but one that would fade too soon. The England of Darwin's boyhood was a place of stark contrasts. The Napoleonic Wars cast a long shadow, yet at home, scientific inquiry and industrial innovation were celebrated. For a boy of Darwin's class, the path was clear: boarding school, followed by university, leading to a respectable profession as a clergyman, a doctor, or a lawyer. Nature was a thing to be managed, a resource to be used, or a subject for polite, amateur appreciation. The idea that the world was ancient, or that life itself could change, was a radical, almost heretical fringe idea, whispered in obscure scientific circles. Young Charles, however, was not a boy who fit neatly into the prescribed mold. The defining event of his early childhood was the death of his mother in 1817, when he was just 8 years old. He would later write that he remembered little of her, save for her deathbed, her black velvet gown, and her curiously constructed work table. This loss left him in a household dominated by his older sisters and his imposing, often critical father. Charles was, by his own admission, a naughty boy. He was not academically gifted in the traditional sense. He was sent to the prestigious Shrewsbury School, where the curriculum was a rigid diet of Latin and Greek classics. He found it dull, impenetrable, and utterly useless. His internal world was not in the classroom, it was outside. He was a collector. He collected minerals, shells, birds' eggs, and above all, beetles. This was his true passion, a secret, consuming joy. He and his older brother Erasmus also built a chemistry shed in their garden, performing experiments that earned Charles the schoolyard nickname Gas. His relationship with his father was the central tension of his youth. Dr. Darwin, a man of science himself, could not understand his son's meandering, seemingly pointless hobbies. He saw the beetle collecting and chemistry as idle diversions from the serious business of education. This frustration culminated in one of the most famous rebukes in the history of science. Dr. Darwin, in complete exasperation, told his teenage son, "You care for nothing but shooting, dogs, and rat catching, and you will be a disgrace to yourself and all your family." These words, Darwin later recalled, stung him deeply. He was not lazy, he was simply interested in the wrong things. He longed for his father's approval, but was constitutionally incapable of finding meaning in the paths laid before him. The core narrative of Darwin's youth is this fundamental disconnect. His education was happening in the fields and riverbanks, not in the halls of Shrewsbury School. He was developing the skills that would define him: meticulous observation, a love for cataloging, and an insatiable why. Why did this beetle have this marking? Why was this plant found here and not there? He wasn't just collecting, he was seeing. He was, without knowing it, training his mind to find patterns in the chaos of the natural world. This was a solitary pursuit, one that built in him a quiet independence and a reliance on his own first-hand observations, a trait that would become his greatest scientific weapon. By the age of 16, Charles was removed from Shrewsbury School, his formal education deemed a failure. Dr. Darwin, still determined to make something of his son, decided that if Charles would not be a scholar, he would be a doctor. It was the family profession, respectable and lucrative. And so, in the autumn of 1825, the boy who loved beetles, the boy who his father feared would be a disgrace, was sent to the University of Edinburgh, one of the finest medical schools in Europe. He was to study medicine. But this path, meant to save him, would instead introduce him to two things that would change his life: the horrors of surgery and the first whispers of radical science. Chapter 2: The Doctor's Reluctance, 1825 to 1827. Edinburgh, Scotland, 1825. This was not the pastoral quiet of Shrewsbury. This was the Athens of the North, a city of granite, smoke, and formidable intellect. The University of Edinburgh was a beacon of the Scottish Enlightenment, a place where ideas were debated with a ferocity and freedom not found in the Anglican-controlled halls of Oxford or Cambridge. The medical school was, at the time, the most respected in the world, but medicine, in the 1820s, was a brutal business. Anesthetics did not exist. Surgery was a spectator sport, performed with terrifying speed in crowded, unhygienic operating theaters. The city was also a hub of natural history. The university's museum was filled with specimens from around the globe, and its scientific societies buzzed with new and often dangerous ideas. Charles arrived with his brother, Erasmus, who was already a student. At first, he found his lectures intolerably dull. The geology lectures by Robert Jameson were particularly dry, so much so that Darwin inwardly vowed, "Never as long as I live to read a book on geology." It is one of history's great ironies. But his true crisis came in the operating theater. He was, by nature, a man of extraordinary sensitivity. He was forced to attend 2 surgeries. The first, on a child, was horrific. He fled the room, unable to bear the sight or the screams. He later wrote, "The 2 cases fairly haunted me for many a long year." This was a profound realization. He could not do it. His stomach and his heart were not suited to the reality of 19th century medicine. His internal world was one of growing dread. He was failing his father again. He was adrift, a medical student who could not stand the sight of blood. He began to skip his medical lectures, finding solace elsewhere. He found a community in the Plinian Society, a student-run natural history club. It was here he found his real education. The society was alive with radical thought. Here, students debated atheism, materialism, and the shocking new ideas of transmutation, the concept that species could change over time. His most important relationship in Edinburgh was not with a professor, but with a man named Robert Grant. Grant was an older, fiercely intelligent zoologist and a passionate admirer of the French naturalist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Lamarck had proposed a theory of evolution, suggesting that life forms could pass on traits they acquired during their lifetimes. The narrative of Edinburgh is Darwin's quiet, intellectual rebellion. While his official studies faltered, his private studies flourished. He and Grant would walk along the shores of the Firth of Forth, collecting specimens from the cold tidal pools. Grant taught him to dissect and study simple marine invertebrates, like the flustra or sea mat. It was on one of these walks that the pivotal moment of this chapter occurred. Grant, Darwin recalled, burst forth in high admiration of Lamarck and his views on evolution. Darwin listened in silent astonishment. He had read his grandfather Erasmus Darwin's own evolutionary poetry, but this was different. This was a respected man of science, seriously discussing a topic that was, in polite society, utterly taboo. Darwin himself presented his first scientific paper to the Plinian Society, a small discovery about the eggs of a sea leech. He was, for the first time, participating in the conversation of science. After 2 years, the truth was undeniable. Charles had no intention of becoming a physician. The operating theater had sealed that fate. He had failed. When Dr. Robert Darwin learned that his son had abandoned his medical studies, his disappointment was immense. He had spent a small fortune, and the family disgrace was back where he started. But Dr. Darwin was not a man to give up. If Charles would not be a doctor, there was one other respectable path for a gentleman of no particular ambition: the church. And so a new plan was hatched. Charles would go to Cambridge University, study divinity, and become a country parson. It was, everyone agreed, a safe, quiet life. It would give him a comfortable home, a place in society, and, as a side benefit, plenty of leisure time, his father surely noted, that he could use for his harmless hobby of collecting beetles. Chapter 3. A Clergyman's Calling, 1828 to 1831. We move south to the ancient cloistered world of Christ's College, Bambridge. The year is 1828. This environment was the very opposite of Edinburgh's radical, smoke-filled debating halls. Cambridge was the heart of the Anglican establishment, a place where science and theology were seen as two parts of a harmonious whole. The prevailing philosophy was natural theology, most famously articulated by William Paley. Paley's argument, which Darwin was required to study, was the watchmaker analogy. If you found a watch on the ground, you would know from its intricate design that it must have had a creator. So too, Paley argued, the intricate design of the natural world, the eye, the wing, the flower, was irrefutable proof of a divine creator. Science, therefore, was the act of studying God's handiwork. Darwin arrived at Cambridge with little enthusiasm for his new calling. He found, just as at Shrewsbury, that he could not force his mind to care for the required subjects. He wasted his time joining a sporting set of wealthy young men. They would ride, shoot, drink, and play cards. He was, for a time, the very image of the idle country gentleman he was supposed to become, but the collecting passion was still there, burning just as fiercely. At Cambridge, it exploded into a perfect mania. His primary pursuit was not theology, but coleoptera, beetle collecting. He became a legend among the student collectors, known for his relentless, almost fanatical dedication. He even had a famous encounter where, having captured a beetle in each hand, he spotted a third, rare specimen. In a flash of inspiration, he popped one of the live beetles into his mouth to free up a hand. He felt guilty about his idleness, yet he was also, for the first time, truly happy. He was popular, he was outdoors, and he was a master of his chosen, if unofficial, craft. Two key relationships defined his Cambridge years, and both would save him from his own idleness. The first was with his cousin, William Darwin Fox, who shared his passion for beetles. It was Fox who normalized his hobby, turning it from a solitary eccentricity into a shared social pursuit. The second, and far more significant, was Professor John Stevens Henslow. Henslow was a brilliant, kindly professor of botany. He was also a clergyman, the perfect embodiment of the Cambridge ideal, a man of God and a man of science. Henslow's lectures were the one part of Darwin's formal education that truly captivated him. Darwin soon became a regular at Henslow's home, attending his open houses for students. The other professors began to call him the man who walks with Henslow. Henslow became the mentor Darwin had been missing, a father figure who, unlike Dr. Darwin, saw his passion for nature not as a failing, but as a gift. The core of this chapter is Darwin's slow pivot from aimless hobbyist to aspiring scientist, guided by Henslow's gentle hand. Henslow did not just teach Darwin botany, he taught on how to be a naturalist. He taught on the rigor of observation, the importance of keeping detailed notes, and the interconnectedness of different scientific fields. As graduation approached, Henslow gave Darwin two books that would, quite literally, set his life's course. The first was Alexander von Humboldt's personal narrative, a thrilling account of scientific exploration in South America. The book ignited in Darwin a burning zeal to travel and contribute to the noble structure of natural science. The second was John Herschel's Introduction to the Study of Natural Philosophy, which argued that science was about finding natural laws to explain phenomena. Inspired, Darwin and some friends planned their own Humboldt-style expedition to the Canary Islands, set for after graduation. He began studying geology with another Cambridge professor, Adam Sedgwick, to prepare. In 1831, Darwin passed his final exams. He had done just enough to secure his degree, ranking 10th out of 178 students who did not seek honors. The path to a quiet country parish was clear. He returned to Shrewsbury, his head filled with plans for his trip to Tenerife. But when he arrived home, two letters were waiting for him. The first brought crushing news. His friend and traveling companion for the Tenerife trip had died. The expedition was off. Darwin was devastated. The second letter was from his mentor, John Stevens Henslow. It contained an offer so unexpected, so extraordinary, that it seemed a fantasy. A naval captain, Robert Fitzroy, was looking for a gentleman naturalist to join him on a 2-year surveying voyage to South America aboard a small ship, HMS Beagle. Henslow had put Darwin's name forward. This was not Tenerife. This was the world. But before he could even dream of accepting, he had to face the one man whose permission he needed and whose disapproval he feared most, his father. Chapter 4. The Wedgwood Intervention, 1831. The offer was staggering, a 2-year, or so it was thought, circumnavigation of the globe, for a 22-year-old whose primary ambition was to see a tropical forest. This was the opportunity of a lifetime. Charles was ecstatic. He rushed to his father, letter in hand. Dr. Robert Darwin's reaction was swift and unequivocal. No. We are at the Mount in Shrewsbury in the summer of 1831. This is a family home defined by the authority of its patriarch. Dr. Darwin was not a tyrant, but he was a practical man. The world was a serious place, and his son had already wasted years and vast sums of money failing at 2 separate careers. This voyage sounded like the most extravagant and dangerous form of idleness yet. Charles was crushed. His father had laid out his objections, point by point. It was a wild scheme. It was disreputable for a future clergyman. The accommodation on a small ship would be dangerously uncomfortable. It was a useless journey that would only further delay his settling into a real life. And finally, he declared, "You will find that everyone you ask will agree with me." Darwin, as always, was respectful of his father's authority. He wrote to Henslow, declining the offer, but he was in turmoil. This was the dream Humboldt had planted in him, the very purpose Henslow had nurtured. To see it evaporate was agonizing. His father's final point, however, that everyone would agree, left a small crack of hope. If he could find one person, one respected man, who disagreed. The key relationship in this chapter is not with his father, but with his uncle, Josiah Wedgwood II. Uncle Jos was the son of the famous potter and the head of the Wedgwood dynasty. He was, to Charles, a second father, a man whose judgment and intelligence were perhaps the only ones Dr. Darwin truly respected as his equal. Defeated, Charles rode to the Wedgwood estate, Meyer Hall, for a planned shooting trip. He brought his father's letter of objections with him. He presented the case to his uncle. Josiah Wedgwood listened patiently. He did not see a cold scheme. He saw a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for a brilliant young mind. He saw the very thing that would make Charles not break him. The narrative core is a simple, brilliant act of persuasion. Josiah Wedgwood sat down and wrote a letter to his brother-in-law, Dr. Robert Darwin. It is a masterpiece of diplomacy. He did not attack Dr. Darwin's reasoning. He simply refuted it, point by point, from the perspective of a fellow man of the world. He argued that the journey was not disreputable, but would, in fact, be a finishing touch to Charles's education. He argued that it was not useless, but a great opportunity for scientific observation. He addressed the discomfort, the cost, and the purpose, and concluded that the pursuit of natural history, while not professional, was very suitable to a clergyman. Dr. Darwin received the letter. He read it, and in a remarkable reversal, he summoned his son. With a hint of humor, he said, "Josiah has answered all my objections. Get you to Cambridge as soon as you can, and say you will accept the post." He had found his one person. The family story holds that Dr. Darwin, having given his consent, was already anticipating the next step, remarking, "But they will want you to be seasick." The shift was instantaneous. Charles was no longer the aimless son. He was, suddenly, the gentleman naturalist. He raced to Cambridge to meet Henslow, only to find the post had been offered to another, but that man too had declined. The post was his. He then traveled to London to meet the man who would be his captain and companion for the next 5 years, Captain Robert Fitzroy. This meeting was, in itself, a crucial test. Fitzroy, an aristocrat, a brilliant surveyor, and a deeply religious man, interviewed Darwin. Fitzroy was a student of phrenology, the pseudoscience of reading character from the shape of the skull, and he later confessed he almost rejected Darwin on account of the shape of his nose, which he felt did not suggest sufficient energy and determination. But Darwin's charm and intelligence won out. The two young men, almost the same age but worlds apart in temperament, agreed to the journey. And so, in the late autumn of 1831, Charles Darwin, the failed medical student and reluctant clergyman-to-be, boarded a 90-foot brig called HMS Beagle. The ship was set to sail on a mission to chart the coast of South America. It would not return for 5 years. Chapter 5. The Weight of Lyell's World, 1831 to 1832. The Beagle was small, incredibly small. Darwin's cabin was a cramped 10 by 11 foot space at the stern, which he shared with 2 other officers. The first few weeks of the voyage were a monotonous misery of delays and false starts due to bad weather. When they finally sailed on December 27, 1831, Darwin's suffering truly began. He was violently, relentlessly seasick. Imagine a 90-foot ship packed with 74 souls facing the full fury of the Atlantic. Darwin spent the first weeks of his great adventure horizontal in his hammock, in a state of profound misery. He was surrounded by the sounds and smells of the sea, the constant motion of the ship, and the professional bustle of a naval crew. He was an outsider, a philosopher among sailors, a landlubber who could not find his sea legs. Darwin's internal world was a mix of physical agony and intellectual excitement. He was wretchedly ill, yet his mind was on fire. He was, for the first time, seeing the world he had only read about. He saw the phosphorescence of the ocean, the flying fish, the deep, pure blue of the open water. He was also beginning a new, rigorous course of study. He had set up a plankton net, collecting the tiny, translucent creatures that drifted by. He was reading, and the most important book he had with him was a gift from Henslow, given to him just before he left. It was volume 1 of a brand new revolutionary book, Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology. His primary relationship on board was with Captain Robert Fitzroy. They were messmates, dining together every evening. Fitzroy was a complex man, a brilliant navigator, a man of science, but also a religious fundamentalist and a Tory aristocrat with a fiery temper. He saw the voyage as a way to find evidence for the biblical account of creation, particularly Noah's flood. He and Darwin, the liberal Whig, debated endlessly. Their conversations were a clash of worldviews, yet marked by a mutual, if sometimes strained, respect. Fitzroy provided the maps. Darwin provided the theory. The other key relationship was with Charles Lyell through the pages of his book. Lyell was not on the ship, but his ideas were. Lyell's book was the central event of this leg of the journey. It argued for a concept called uniformitarianism. The prevailing theory of the day was catastrophism, the idea that the Earth's features, mountains, canyons, were shaped by sudden, violent, biblical events like the Great Flood. Lyell argued the opposite. He proposed that the Earth was shaped not by sudden catastrophes, but by the same slow, gradual processes we see at work today. Wind eroding rock, rivers carving valleys, sediment settling in the sea. The implication was staggering. For these slow processes to create the world we see, the Earth could not be just 6,000 years old, as the Bible implied. It must be unthinkably, unimaginably ancient. Darwin, horribly seasick, read Lyell's words. And when the Beagle made its first landfall at the St. Jago Islands in the Cape Verdes, he stepped onto the volcanic rock. And he saw Lyell's world with his own eyes. He observed a band of white seashells embedded in a layer of rock above the high tide mark. He realized, using Lyell's logic, that this land must have been under the sea and had been uplifted slowly and gradually over eons. It was, he said, a new and profound pleasure. He was no longer just a collector of beetles. He was a geologist. This realization was the key that unlocked everything else. Darwin's mind was now primed. He had been given a new lens through which to see the world, deep time. The Earth was not a static stage. It was a dynamic, ancient, constantly changing system. He had found his calling. His purpose on this voyage would not be to collect curiosities, but to apply Lyell's grand theory. He would be the historian of the Earth's processes. As the Beagle crossed the Atlantic and made its way to the coast of Brazil, Darwin was no longer just a passenger. He was a scientist with a framework. And as he stepped into the overwhelming, vibrant chaos of a South American rainforest for the first time, he would soon find evidence that this deep time applied not just to rocks, but perhaps, just perhaps, to life itself. Chapter 6: Echoes of a Lost Continent, 1832 to 1835. For the next 4 years, the Beagle meticulously charted the coastline of South America. This was not a quick visit. It was a slow, painstaking survey, giving Darwin the unprecedented opportunity for long expeditions inland, sometimes for months at a time, while the ship worked the coast. South America was a revelation. Darwin stepped ashore in Brazil and was, he wrote, in a perfect hurricane of delight. He was wandering in a chaos of delight, surrounded by a bewildering diversity of life that made England's fauna seem pale and sparse. But it was not just the life that captured him. It was the land. He was traveling across the pampas of Argentina, riding with gauchos, and climbing into the dizzying, raw peaks of the Andes. This was a new continent, vast and ancient. Darwin's internal world was one of constant, rigorous observation. He was no longer the seasick boy. He was a hardened explorer. He kept voluminous notes on everything: geology, plants, insects, people. And in these notes, a profound question began to form, a species mystery that would haunt him. He was obsessed with distribution. Why were the animals in South America so different from those in Africa, even when the climates were similar? And why did the species change as he moved south? He noted that the rhea, a large flightless bird, was replaced by a similar but smaller species in Patagonia. Why? His key relationships were twofold. First, with the gauchos who guided him across the pampas. He admired their skill and rugged independence. They were his guides into this new world, helping him find the fossils that would become so crucial. Second, his intellectual relationship with the fossils themselves. He was, in essence, in a dialogue with the past. The core of this chapter is Darwin's encounter with the dead. In Patagonia, he began to unearth the fossilized bones of gigantic extinct mammals. He found the remains of a megatherium, a giant ground sloth the size of an elephant. He found Glyptodon, an armored creature like a modern armadillo, but the size of a small car. This was the aha moment. These giant extinct creatures were unmistakably similar to the living, but much smaller, sloths and armadillos that were scurrying around him in the same location. This observation struck him as profoundly important. The standard explanation, catastrophism, was that God had created these giant creatures, a flood had wiped them out, and then a new set of smaller creatures had been created to replace them. But to Darwin, this seemed clumsy, inefficient. A much simpler explanation presented itself. What if the extinct Glyptodon and the living armadillo were related? What if one was the ancestor of the other? What if species were not created twice, but were connected by descent with modification? This was a radical, thrilling, and dangerous idea. It directly contradicted the biblical narrative. It suggested a continuity of life, a transmutation from one form to another, driven by the slow changes of the land itself. This idea, the law of succession of types, was the first original revolutionary thought of his journey. He had connected the living with the dead. He had connected the geological change of the continent with the biological change of its inhabitants. This puzzle piece was now firmly in his mind. He did not have a theory for how this change happened, but he was becoming convinced that it did happen. His mind was buzzing with these new questions. And in 1835, after a harrowing passage around Cape Horn and a long survey of the Chilean coast, the Beagle sailed west into the vast Pacific. It was headed for a small, isolated cluster of volcanic islands, a place that meant nothing to the rest of the world, but which would, for Darwin, become the key to everything, the Galapagos. Chapter 7. The Finches of Galapagos, 1835. In September 1835, the Beagle anchored off the Galapagos archipelago. This was not the lush paradise of Brazil. This was a new, strange, and unsettling world. Darwin's first impression was of a shore fit for pandemonium. The islands were black, volcanic, and jagged. The air was hot, dry, and smelled of sulfur and baking guano. Giant marine iguanas, which he called imps of darkness, littered the black rocks. Giant tortoises lumbered through the dry, thorny brush. The place felt primal, a blot on the map, as Herman Melville would later write, a place where time itself seemed to have stopped. Darwin was, by this point, a master geologist. He was far more interested in the volcanic cones and craters than in the animals. He was also a little homesick, the voyage having already stretched on for 4 years. His observation of the animals was, at first, almost casual. He was collecting, as always, but he was not yet seeing the grand pattern. He was in a state of profound, productive confusion. Why were these creatures so different from the South American mainland, yet so clearly related? Why did they look antediluvian? A key, if fleeting, relationship here was with Nicholas Lawson, the acting English vice-governor of the islands. Lawson made a casual remark to Darwin that would echo in his mind for years. He mentioned that he could tell, with certainty, which island a giant tortoise came from, simply by the shape of its shell. Darwin at the time dismissed it. He thought the tortoises had just been imported by sailors. It was a catastrophic, if temporary, failure of his own method. His other crucial relationship was with his assistant, Sims Covington. Darwin was collecting birds from the different islands, but he was careless. He lumped them all together, not even labeling which island each bird came from. He thought they were a random assortment of finches, wrens, and grow beaks. The central narrative of the Galapagos is, ironically, Darwin's failure to grasp its significance while he was there. He was standing in his own laboratory, but he wasn't yet asking the right questions. He collected the famous birds, now known as Darwin's finches, but he saw them as a jumble of different types. He did note the mockingbirds. He observed that the mockingbirds on one island were slightly different from those on another, and he did label these with more care. This was the first crack. He mused in his notes. If there is the slightest foundation for these remarks, the zoology of archipelagos will be well worth examining, for such facts would undermine the stability of species. Undermine the stability of species. The thought was there, a ghost in the back of his mind, but he did not and could not connect the dots. He had the puzzle pieces, but he was still looking at them individually. The Beagle sailed from the Galapagos after 5 weeks. Darwin had his collection of rather dull-looking birds and his notes on mockingbirds. The great eureka moment of the finches, so often depicted in films, never happened. It was a slow, dawning realization that would only begin after he returned to England. The true significance of these specimens would remain locked away in his crates for months. It would only be upon his return to London, when he handed his jumbled collection of birds to a professional ornithologist, that the world-changing secret of the Galapagos would finally be revealed. The voyage home was beginning, and Darwin's mind was now a catalogue of mysteries he could not yet solve. Chapter 8. The Coral Ring of Truth, 1836. The Beagle sailed west, across the vast, empty expanse of the Pacific. Darwin, with the Galapagos fading behind him, had time to think. He was homesick and tired, but his mind was relentlessly active. His next great intellectual conquest would not be on land, but in the middle of the ocean. The ship was sailing toward Tahiti and then on to New Zealand and Australia. The great problem of the Pacific at that time was the existence of coral atolls. These are perfect rings of low-lying coral islands, often enclosing a clear, calm lagoon found in the deepest parts of the ocean. How did they form? Coral polyps cannot live in the deep, cold, dark water. They must grow in shallow, sunlit seas. So, how could these massive reefs exist? Thousands of miles from any continent, rising from ocean floors that were miles deep. Darwin, the geologist, was puzzled by this. The prevailing theory, promoted by his own hero, Charles Lyell, was that these atolls were coral reefs that had grown on the circular rims of extinct, submerged volcanoes. Darwin found this explanation unsatisfying. Why would there be so many volcanoes, all just barely submerged beneath the surface, all in a perfect ring? It seemed too coincidental. His mind, now steeped in Lyell's own logic of slow, gradual change, began to formulate a different, more elegant, and far grander theory. His primary relationship here was, once again, with Lyell in absentia. He was challenging his own mentor. He was also, for the first time, developing a theory before seeing the evidence, rather than the other way around. He was moving from observation to prediction. Darwin's idea was simple, but brilliant. What if, he reasoned, the land was not static? He had seen the Andes rising. What if, in other parts of the world, the land was sinking? He proposed a three-stage process. 1. Fringing reef. A new volcanic island emerges from the sea. Coral begins to grow in the shallow water, forming a fringing reef around its shore. 2. Barrier reef. The volcanic island slowly begins to sink, subsiding back into the Earth's crust. The coral, which is alive, grows upwards to stay in the sunlight, creating a barrier reef separated from the sinking island by a wide lagoon. 3. Atoll. Finally, the volcanic island sinks completely beneath the waves, leaving only the ring of living coral at the surface. This was his theory. It explained all three types of reefs as simply different stages of the same process, all driven by the slow, imperceptible sinking of the ocean floor. When the Beagle arrived at Tahiti, he saw the fringing reefs. When it sailed to other islands, he saw the barrier reefs. And when it reached the Cocos, Keeling Islands in the Indian Ocean, he saw the perfect atoll. His theory, conceived in his cabin, was confirmed by the evidence. This was a massive intellectual victory. It was his first great original scientific contribution, and he had solved a mystery that had baffled Lyell himself. He had, in essence, proven that the entire floor of the Pacific Ocean was in motion, a vast geological engine. On October 1836, 5 long years after he had left, HMS Beagle dropped anchor at Falmouth, England. The 27-year-old who returned was not the same man who had left. He was no longer the aimless boy, the failed doctor, or the reluctant clergyman. He was a seasoned explorer, a respected geologist, and the owner of a collection of specimens and a set of notebooks that held the seeds of a revolution. He was, as he stepped ashore, a man of science. But the real work was just beginning. Chapter 9. The Transmutation Notebooks, 1837-1838. London, 1837. Darwin was a minor celebrity. His letters and specimens, sent home by Henslow, had been read at scientific societies. He was no longer Dr. Darwin's boy. He was Darwin of the Beagle. He was embraced by the scientific elite, dining with Charles Lyell, now his peer, the anatomist Richard Owen, and the brilliant polymath Charles Babbage. This was the most intellectually fertile period of his life. He was living in a whirl of London activity, sorting his vast collections, writing his journal of researches, now known as The Voyage of the Beagle, and presenting papers. The air was electric with ideas. But beneath this public work, a secret private investigation had begun. Darwin's mind was fixated on the species mystery, the fossils, the rheas, the mockingbirds. He was convinced that transmutation was real, but how? This was the question of questions. He knew that to even suggest such a thing was scientific and social dynamite. It was an idea associated with French radicals and atheists. He had to be certain. He had to have a mechanism. So, in 1837, he began a series of secret notebooks. He labeled them B, C, D, and E. These transmutation notebooks were his private workspace, his thought laboratory, where he could jot down any fact, any speculation, any wild idea, safe from the judgment of his peers. The key relationship of this chapter was with an ornithologist named John Gould. This relationship provided the spark. Darwin had taken his jumbled collection of Galapagos birds to Gould, the expert at the Zoological Society. Gould took one look at them and delivered a bombshell. Gould informed Darwin that the birds he had dismissed as a random assortment of finches, wrens, and grosbeaks were, in fact, all finches. They were a group of entirely new species, found nowhere else in the world, and, most critically, they were all closely related, but their beaks were spectacularly different, each one perfectly adapted for a different food source: seed crushing, insect probing, cactus eating. This was the eureka moment that had not happened in the Galapagos. Darwin was stunned. He realized his colossal mistake. The different species had been modified from a common ancestor that must have arrived from the mainland, and then, isolated on the different islands, they had adapted to different places in the economy of nature. This was it: isolation and adaptation. In his notebooks, he began to sketch. He drew a branching diagram, a tree. At the base, he wrote 1. This was the common ancestor. From it, branches split and split again, representing new modified species. It was the first tree of life. Above this rough sketch, he scribbled 2 powerful words: I think. He now had a pattern, descent from a common ancestor, branching out like a tree, but he still didn't have the mechanism. What was the engine of this change? Why did some branches die off and others survive? Darwin was now a transmutationist in private. He had his pattern. He was reading voraciously, looking for clues. He read about animal breeding, how farmers selected for traits in pigeons and pigs. This artificial selection was a clue, but what was the natural equivalent? What force in the wild did the selecting? He was on the verge of his greatest insight. He was exhausted, overworked, and increasingly unwell, suffering from the mysterious illness that would soon plague him. He needed a break, and for a change of scene, he picked up a book to read for amusement. That book would provide the final, crucial piece of the puzzle. Chapter 10. An Argument from Malthus, 1838. The year is 1838. Darwin is 29 years old. He is a successful scientist, but he is hiding the biggest secret in science. He has his tree of life, but no engine to drive it. He knows species change, but he doesn't know why. We are in Darwin's study in London. He is surrounded by his books and specimens. His health is beginning to fail. He suffers from heart palpitations, stomach distress, and profound fatigue. The whirlwind of London life, which he once enjoyed, is now wearing him down. He is in a state of intense mental exertion, and his body is protesting. His internal world is consumed by the species question. He is looking for a law, a universal force of nature. He has observed that farmers and pigeon fanciers can create wildly different breeds by selecting the traits they want: faster horses, fatter pigs, fancier pigeons. This artificial selection is a powerful force for change, but where in nature is the selector, there is no farmer in the wild. He is stuck. The idea of a divine selector is what he's trying to move away from. The force had to be natural, inherent to the system itself. The key relationship in this chapter is not with a person, but with an idea, presented by a long-dead economist. In October of 1838, for amusement, Darwin picked up a copy of Thomas Malthus's An Essay on the Principle of Population. Malthus's argument was stark, simple, and pessimistic. He argued that human populations will always grow geometrically, 2, 4, 8, 16, while the food supply to support them only grows arithmetically, 1, 2, 3, 4. The inevitable result, Malthus concluded, is a struggle for existence. There simply is not enough food, space, or resources for everyone who is born. Poverty, famine, disease, and war are not aberrations. They are the natural checks that keep the population in line. Darwin read this, and he had his eureka moment. He later wrote, "It at once struck me that under these circumstances, favorable variations would tend to be preserved and unfavorable ones to be destroyed. The result of this would be the formation of new species." It was a flash of insight. Malthus was writing about humans, but Darwin saw that this struggle for existence was everywhere in nature. Every plant, every animal, every insect produces far more offspring than can possibly survive. A single codfish lays millions of eggs. An orchid produces thousands of seeds. The world, therefore, is a battlefield, a constant, silent, relentless competition for resources. And in that competition, which individuals would be the ones to survive and reproduce? The ones who had a slight accidental advantage. A finch with a slightly stronger beak, a fox with slightly better camouflage, a plant with a slightly deeper root. This was the selector he had been looking for. It wasn't an external intelligence. It was death. It was competition. He called this mechanism natural selection. It was simple. It was brutal. And it explained everything. It explained the branching tree of life. It explained the fossils, the finches, the similarity between the glyptodon and the armadillo. It was the engine. This was the theory. 1838. He had it. The species mystery was solved, but he did not publish. He did not tell anyone, save for a few trusted friends. Why? He was, he later said, so anxious to avoid prejudice. He knew what this idea meant. It removed the need for a watchmaker god. It made humans just another branch on the tree. It was dangerous. He was also unwell, and he was about to make the most important personal decision of his life. He needed stability, a quiet place to work, and a companion who could care for him. In 1839, he proposed to his first cousin, Emma Wedgwood. Chapter 11. The Anchor of Down House, 1839 to 1842. In January 1839, Charles Darwin married Emma Wedgwood. The marriage was a foundation. Emma was intelligent, organized, and deeply, devoutly religious. Charles was an affectionate husband, but his scientific views were already drifting far from the Anglican faith she held so dear. They began their married life in London, but Darwin's health collapsed. The noise, the social obligations, the dirt of the city were too much for his fragile constitution. He was plagued by vomiting, weakness, and crippling fatigue. He could not work. He needed an escape. In 1842, they found their sanctuary, a large, unpretentious country home called Down House in the quiet rural village of Down in Kent. This would be his home, his laboratory, and his refuge for the rest of his life. Darwin's internal world was now split. Publicly, he was the celebrated author of The Voyage of the Beagle and his work on coral reefs. He was a pillar of the scientific community. Privately, he was a heretic. He was Darwin the transmutationist. He was living a double life. He was also a devoted father. His children, he and Emma would have 10, became a new source of joy and a new subject of scientific observation. He kept detailed notes on their development, their first expressions, their instinctive behaviors, seeing in them the same evolutionary patterns he saw in the rest of nature. His illness, while a constant burden, also became his shield. It allowed him to retreat from the world, to avoid the debates and committees, and to focus, with monastic single-mindedness, on his one great work. His relationship with Emma was central. She was his dear nurse. She managed the household, protected him from unwanted visitors, and created the bubble of routine and quiet that allowed him to work. Theirs was a deep and loving bond, but it had one profound tension: religion. Emma worried for her husband's immortal soul. She knew his dangerous ideas. She wrote him a beautiful, heartbreaking letter. May not the habit in scientific pursuits of believing nothing till it is proved influence your mind too much in other things which cannot be proved in the same way, and which, if true, are likely to be above our comprehension. Charles kept this letter with him, adding his own pained note at the bottom: "When I am dead, know that I have kissed and cried over this many times." His other key relationship was with the botanist Joseph Hooker. Hooker, young, brilliant, and skeptical, became Darwin's closest confidant. It was to Hooker, in 1804, that Darwin would finally confess his secret. The narrative of these years is one of deliberate, patient construction. Darwin knew he could not publish his theory without overwhelming evidence. The world was not ready. So, in 1842, he sat down and wrote, in pencil, a 35-page sketch of his theory. It was the first time he had put all the pieces together on paper. 2 years later, in 1804, he expanded this into a 230-page essay. This was the full, detailed argument. He had it all: Malthus, the finches, the fossils, the tree of life. He then had the essay bound and gave it to Emma. He included a letter to be read only upon his death. It gave her instructions to find an editor, he suggested Lyell or Hooker, and gave her £400 to have it published. He wrote, "I have just finished my sketch of my species theory. If, as I believe, my theory is true, it will be a considerable step in science." He called it My Species Theory. He was, in effect, writing his own scientific will, convinced that he might not live to publish it himself. He had written his theory. He had secured its potential future. And then he put it in a drawer. He did not publish. Why? He was still terrified of the backlash. He was still amassing evidence. He called it like confessing a murder. Instead of publishing the essay, he turned his attention to a small project, a way to bolster his credentials as a species man. He decided to study, in minute detail, one single group of animals. This small project, he thought, might take a year or two. It would take him 8. Chapter 12. The Long Delay, 1804-1854. This is, perhaps, the strangest chapter in Darwin's life. He has solved the mystery of mysteries. He holds in his hands a theory that will revolutionize biology, a theory he believes is true, and he shelves it. For the next decade, the world hears nothing of natural selection. Darwin, from the sanctuary of Down House, publishes on geology and the Beagle findings, but on the species question, he is silent. Down House is now his world. He lives by a strict, repetitive, almost monastic routine, dictated by his illness. A walk on his sandwalk path, an hour of work in his study, a rest on the sofa while Emma reads to him, another hour of work. This routine was his defense against his body's wretched state. The house was a fortress of quiet domestic life, punctuated by the sounds of his growing children. Why the delay? This is the great Darwin mystery. Historians have debated it for a century. Was it fear? Yes. He knew his theory would be seen as an attack on God, on social order, on human dignity. He was a respectable, wealthy landowner. He did not want to be a pariah. Was it perfectionism? Yes. He felt he needed more evidence. He wanted his argument to be unassailable. He began a vast global correspondence, writing to naturalists, explorers, and hobbyists around the world, asking for specimens, for data on variation. Was it a strategic delay? Perhaps. He was waiting for the world to catch up. Books like Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, published anonymously in 1804, were already softening up the public to the idea of evolution, even if its mechanism was scientifically weak. His internal world was a complex of patience, anxiety, and meticulous plodding work. He was playing the long game. His key relationships were now his correspondents. He wrote to pigeon fanciers in London, asking to see their breeds. He wrote to explorers, asking them to ship him exotic plants. He wrote to Joseph Hooker, his closest confidant, and Charles Lyell, his mentor, dropping hints, half confessing, but never revealing the full mechanism. He was slowly building a small insider network, preparing the ground for an idea he was still too cautious to plant. The narrative of this decade is the absence of a narrative. It is the story of a deliberate, calculated pause. Darwin was building his fortress of facts. He began a series of experiments in his own garden. He tested seed dispersal by soaking them in salt water for weeks to see if they could survive a voyage from a mainland to an island. They could. He studied the pollination of flowers, the behavior of earthworms. He was living his theory, testing every small component of it in his own backyard. This was not a delay in the sense of inaction. It was a period of incubation. He was transforming himself from a voyaging naturalist into an experimental scientist. By 1854, the world had changed. Science was more professional. The Vestiges book, though criticized, had made transmutation a topic of drawing room conversation. Darwin's own friends, Lyell and Hooker, were privately warning him that someone else would soon publish a similar idea if he waited too long. Hooker, in particular, was pressing him. Darwin, finally feeling the pressure and having at last finished his other project, made a decision. In 1854, he cleared his desk. He took the 1844 essay out of his drawer. He was going to write his big book. He would call it Natural Selection. It would be a massive multi-volume work, the gospel of his theory, so packed with evidence it would crush all opposition. He began to write. But first, he had to publish the results of the small project he had started 8 years earlier. Chapter 13. The Pigeons and the Barnacles, 1846 to 1854. To understand the long delay, we must understand the barnacles and the pigeons. While the essay on species sat in his drawer, Darwin embarked on two seemingly bizarre, obsessive studies. His study at Down House became a laboratory. On one side, a pigeon loft was built. He joined London pigeon fancying clubs, astonishing the working-class breeders with his gentlemanly, scientific fascination. He had specimens of every known breed: the tumbler, the pouter, the fantail. On the other side of his study, his microscope. For 8 solid years, 1846 to 1854, he dedicated himself to the study of Cirripedia, barnacles. He had specimens sent to him from all over the world. He spent thousands of hours dissecting these tiny, tedious, perplexing crustaceans. His children, growing up, assumed that all fathers spent their days looking at barnacles through a microscope. This was not a distraction. This was the work. The pigeons were his model for variation and artificial selection. He needed to prove that the wildly different breeds, which, if found in the wild, would be called different species, all descended from one common ancestor, the simple rock dove. By breeding them himself, he demonstrated the plasticity of life, the immense untapped variation hidden within every population. The barnacles were his model for natural variation and speciation. They were a mess of a species group. It was almost impossible to tell where one species ended and another variety began. This messiness was his evidence. It was exactly what his theory predicted: not neat, fixed boxes of species, but a fluid, continuous spectrum of change, with incipient species forming all the time. This 8-year ordeal was his apprenticeship in the trenches of biology. He was no longer just a geologist or a voyager. He was becoming a species man, an anatomist, a biologist's biologist. His primary relationship was with the specimens themselves, but this work also cemented his reputation. When his massive 4-volume monograph on barnacles was finally published, he was awarded the Royal Society's Royal Medal. He had, in the eyes of his peers, paid his dues. No one could ever again accuse him of being a mere collector or speculator. He was a world-class authority on taxonomy. The narrative is one of obsessive microscopic focus. Imagine the man who held the secret to all life, spending 8 years cataloging the differences in the reproductive organs of tiny, saltwater creatures. It was an act of supreme scientific patience. He discovered bizarre complemental males, tiny, parasitic males that lived attached to the larger females. He was, in short, mapping the tree of life in one of its most confusing branches. This work taught him, intimately, just how much variation existed in the wild. It gave him the confidence and the authority he felt he needed to finally present his grand theory. In 1854, the barnacle work was finished. He was at last ready. He had his model of artificial selection, pigeons, and his model of natural variation, barnacles. He was 45 years old. His health was stable in its own fragile way. He opened his notebook for his big book, Natural Selection. He began to write, slowly, meticulously, building his unassailable case. He wrote chapters on variation under domestication, variation under nature, and the struggle for existence. He wrote and wrote and wrote. For 4 years, he labored on this magnum opus. He was, by 1858, more than halfway through a book that would have spanned thousands of pages. And then, on the morning of June 18th, 1858, the postman arrived at Down House. He brought a letter from a distant jungle-choked island in the Malay archipelago. It was from a naturalist named Alfred Russel Wallace, and it contained a paper that would change everything. Chapter 14. The Letter from Ternate, 1858. Ternate, Malay Archipelago. A young British naturalist named Alfred Russel Wallace is recovering from a bout of malaria. He is, like Darwin, a species man. He too has traveled the world. He too is haunted by the mystery of how species change. While recovering in his fever, Wallace, just as Darwin had 20 years earlier, recalls the work of Thomas Malthus, The Struggle for Existence. And in a flash of feverish insight, he too conceives of the mechanism, natural selection. Excited, Wallace writes a 20-page paper on the tendency of varieties to depart indefinitely from the original type. He wants a second opinion. He decides to send it to the one man in England he admires most, the man whose voyage of the Beagle inspired him, the man who, he has been told, is also interested in the species question, Charles Darwin. June 18, 1858. Down House. Darwin receives the package. He opens it. He reads Wallace's paper. His world shatters. It is not a theory. It is his theory. It is natural selection, descent with modification, the tree of life. Wallace has, in a few days, summarized the work of Darwin's entire lifetime. Darwin's internal state is one of pure, unadulterated panic. He is forestalled. He is in despair. He writes to his friend, Charles Lyell, "I never saw a more striking coincidence. If Wallace had my MS sketch written out in 1842, he could not have made a better short abstract. So all my originality, whatever it may amount to, will be smashed." To make matters worse, his personal life is in crisis. His daughter, Etty, is sick with diphtheria, and his infant son, Charles Waring, is critically ill with scarlet fever. His internal world is a storm of professional dread and profound personal grief. He is paralyzed by an ethical dilemma. If he publishes his own work now, he is a thief. If he doesn't, the work of his entire life is lost. He is, by nature, a modest and non-confrontational man. He cannot steal priority. He throws the problem at the feet of his two closest friends, Charles Lyell and Joseph Hooker. They are his champions, his fixers. They know he has been working on this for 20 years. They have seen the 1844 essay. Lyell and Hooker move quickly. They devise a delicate arrangement. They will not let Darwin's life's work be smashed, but they must acknowledge Wallace. Their solution is a compromise. They decide to present both Wallace's paper and extracts from Darwin's 1844 essay, along with a recent letter to an American botanist, at the next meeting of the Linnean Society of London. This will establish joint priority. The date is July 1st, 1858. It is one of the most important moments in the history of science. The presentation itself was a complete anticlimax. Darwin, consumed by grief, his infant son had died just days earlier, was not present. Wallace was still in the Malay archipelago, completely unaware of what was happening. The papers were read to a small, sleepy crowd. There was no debate. There was no shock. The president of the society, at the end of the year, famously remarked that 1858 had not been marked by any of those striking discoveries which at once revolutionized the sciences. The world had not noticed, but Lyell and Hooker had lit the fuse. They now turned back to Darwin. The delicate arrangement had bought him time, but his big book was now obsolete. It would take years more to finish. They gave him a new, urgent instruction. You must publish, now. You must write an abstract of your theory. A shorter book, one that can be produced in months, not years. The delay was over. The secret was out. Spurred by Wallace and urged on by his friends, Darwin sat down at his desk. He began to write, not his big book, but the abstract that would change the world. Chapter 15. A Species of Abstract, 1858-1859. The race was on. From July 1858, Darwin worked at a furious pace. His abstract was no longer an abstract. It was becoming a full, dense, powerful book. He was condensing 20 years of thought, evidence, and argument into a single volume. Down House, 1858 to 1859. The routine is now one of desperate, focused labor. He is ill, tired, and in a hurry. His health suffers under the strain. He writes for hours, his stomach in a constant state of rebellion, and then dictates to his children's governess when he is too weak to hold the pen. His publisher, John Murray, is nervous. A book about pigeons might sell, but this transmutation idea is deeply troubling. Darwin is no longer the timid conveyor of a murder. He is an advocate. He is writing for his life, for his priority, but also for his theory. He is determined to make his one long argument as persuasive as possible. He is terrified of the reception, but he is also finally committed. He pours all of his evidence, the pigeons, the barnacles, the fossils, the finches, the geographical distribution, the anatomy, into the text. He is, he wrote, like a man writing against time. He struggles, most of all, with the ending. How to address the most explosive implication of all, humankind? He knows he cannot. The world is not ready. He decides to dodge the question, to leave it for another day. His key relationship is with his publisher, John Murray, who agrees to publish the book Sight Unseen, based on Darwin's reputation, and with Lyell and Hooker, who are acting as his academic seconds in the impending duel of ideas, and, of course, with Alfred Russel Wallace. Darwin, full of integrity, ensures Wallace is given full credit as the co-discoverer. The two men begin a correspondence that will last the rest of their lives, a relationship of profound mutual respect, even as they disagree on key points. Wallace, for instance, could never accept that the human mind was a product of natural selection. The core narrative is the writing of the book, 13 months of relentless work. He calls it My Abstract. The title is still in flux. At last, they settle on one. On November 24th, 1859, the book is published. The title is On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. The first print run of 1,050 copies sells out on the first day. The murder was out. The world, which had slept through the Linnaean Society meeting, was now wide awake. The reaction was immediate and explosive. It was not a sleepy academic debate. It was a cultural firestorm. The book was reviewed, debated, attacked, and defended in every newspaper, journal, and pulpit in England. Scientists like Joseph Hooker and the young, brilliant, and aggressive Thomas Henry Huxley rushed to Darwin's defense. The church and scientists loyal to the old natural theology, like Richard Owen, attacked it with fury. They called it a brutal and degrading philosophy. Darwin himself, true to form, retreated. He was at Down House, as sick as a dog, reading the reviews, feeding information to his generals in the field. He had provided the text. The battle for its acceptance would be fought by others, and the first great public showdown was just months away. Chapter 16, The Oxford Showdown, 1860. The storm had broken. The Origin of Species was the most talked about and most controversial book of its day. The flashpoint came on June 30th, 1860, at a meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science held at the Oxford University Museum. The room was packed. Over 700 people, students, clergymen, scientists, and the general public had crammed in, hungry for a fight. The official topic was a different paper entirely, but everyone knew what this was about. This was the first public debate on Darwin's theory. On one side sat Soapy Sam Wilberforce, the Bishop of Oxford. He was a famed orator, a brilliant, witty debater. He had been coached for the debate by Darwin's greatest scientific enemy, the anatomist Richard Owen. On the other side sat Darwin's agents in the field, Joseph Hooker, and, most importantly, Thomas Henry Huxley. Huxley was 35, sharp, articulate, and Darwin's bulldog, a man who would not suffer fools gladly. Charles Darwin, of course, was nowhere to be seen. He was ill at a spa, far from the fray. Huxley's internal world was one of combative confidence. He had read The Origin and felt it was a flash of light, a new foundation for biology. He was there to do battle for scientific truth against what he saw as theological bigotry. Bishop Wilberforce's internal world was one of righteous defense. He believed Darwin's theory was not just scientifically wrong, but morally dangerous, a threat to the very foundation of faith and human decency. The entire event was a web of relationships. Wilberforce versus Huxley, Owen in the shadows versus Darwin in absentia. Hooker, Darwin's oldest friend, was there to support him. The old guard of science, allied with the church, was facing the new guard of professional, secular science. The debate was long and technical. Then, Bishop Wilberforce made his move. He turned away from the scientific argument and toward his opponent, Huxley, for a personal, rhetorical kill. In a mocking, supercilious tone, he asked Huxley, "I would like to ask Professor Huxley, was it through your grandfather or your grandmother that you claim your descent from a monkey?" The room erupted. It was a hit, a brilliant piece of ridicule. Huxley was unprepared. He was facing a master orator. According to the legend, Huxley turned to his colleague and whispered, "The Lord hath delivered him into mine hands." He then rose to his feet. He calmly, and first, explained that he had listened to, but that the bishop's arguments were devoid of scientific merit. And then he addressed the insult directly. "I am not ashamed to have a monkey for an ancestor, but I would be ashamed to be connected with a man who used great gifts to obscure the truth. A man who, not content with an equivocal success in his own sphere of activity, plunges into scientific questions with which he has no real acquaintance, only to obscure them by aimless rhetoric and distract the attention of his hearers from the real point at issue, by eloquent digressions and skilled appeals to religious prejudice." The effect was electrifying. The room was in an uproar. One woman fainted. The debate had swung. Huxley had not just answered the bishop, he had reframed the entire debate. This was not about monkeys. This was about truth. It was about whether science would be free to follow its own evidence, or whether it would remain subservient to religious prejudice. The Oxford debate was a symbolic victory. It didn't prove Darwin's theory, but it announced that his theory was a serious scientific contender, and that it would be defended, publicly and fiercely, by a new generation of scientists. The battle for origin was underway. But Darwin, back at Down House, knew that he had left the most difficult part of his argument unsaid. He had, in his great book, written only one cryptic sentence on the most important species of all: "Light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history." The 1860s raged with this debate, but the time was coming when Darwin would have to address head-on the ape question himself. Chapter 17, The Descent of Man, 1871. A decade had passed since the origin of species. The world had, in many ways, caught up. Evolution, if not natural selection, was now a mainstream idea. Huxley, Hooker, Lyell, and others had fought the public battles. Darwin, now in his 60s, was the sage of Down, an almost mythical figure. Down House, late 1860s. Darwin is older, frailer, but his mind is still working. He has published on the fertilization of orchids and the variation of animals and plants under domestication. He has built his fortress of facts even higher, but he knows his one long argument is incomplete. He has left the final taboo untouched. He feels the time is now right. He is no longer afraid. He is an established, revered, and untouchable figure. He can say what he thinks. He decides to write the book that Origin was always pointing towards. He will finally, explicitly, apply his theory to Homo sapiens. His internal world is one of calm, scientific resolution. He will take the same method, observation, comparison, gradual change, and apply it to the human body, the human mind, and human society. His allies, Huxley and Wallace, have already written about human evolution. Huxley's Man's Place in Nature had already demonstrated anatomically the uncomfortable closeness of apes and humans. But Darwin was going further. He was not just going to talk about the body, he was going to talk about the mind. And this is where he and his co-discoverer, Alfred Russel Wallace, would part ways. Wallace, a spiritualist, could not accept that the noble faculties of the human mind, morality, art, consciousness, could be the product of a blind, material process like natural selection. He insisted on a divine spark. Darwin disagreed. He would be a whole hogger. In 1871, he published The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. It was, in some ways, 2 books. The first part was The Descent of Man. It was essentially the chapter he had omitted from Origin. He laid out the evidence, step by step. He compared human anatomy to that of apes and other mammals. He argued that human emotions, love, fear, jealousy, were present in lower animals. He argued that our moral sense itself was an evolutionary adaptation, a product of social instincts that benefited the tribe. He argued unequivocally that humans shared a common ancestor with the great apes. The second part of the book was his new grand theory: sexual selection. This was his answer to a problem Origin had not solved. Why do some animals have useless, extravagant features, like the peacock's tail? These features don't help in the struggle for existence. They are a hindrance. Darwin argued that there was a second kind of selection, not just a struggle for survival, but a struggle for reproduction. The peacock's tail, he argued, evolved not to survive, but to attract a mate. This female choice, this aesthetic sense in animals, was a powerful evolutionary engine. It was a radical idea, suggesting that beauty and mind were factors in evolution. The Descent of Man was, in many ways, more shocking than the Origin. The Origin had attacked God. The Descent attacked us. It brutalized humanity, removing our special status. The backlash was predictable, but the cultural ground had shifted. The book was a huge success. The ape theory was now Darwin's theory. He had done it. He had completed his argument. He was now an old man. He had spent his life in the eye of an intellectual hurricane he had created. Now he could finally, in his last decade, turn his mind back to the quiet, simple things that had first captured his imagination as a boy. Chapter 18: The Sage and the Worms, 1872 to 1882. The great battles were over. Darwin was, by the 1870s, the sage of Down, the most famous scientist in the world. He was our great philosopher, a figure of quiet, immense authority. Down House in his final years. The Sandwalk, his thinking path, is worn deep with the tread of his daily walks. His study is a museum of his life's work. His children are grown. His wife, Emma, is his constant companion. The world comes to him. He receives letters from every corner of the globe. He is old and weak, his illness a constant companion, but his mind is as curious as ever. His internal world is one of deep, quiet satisfaction. He is no longer fighting. He is observing. He has returned to his first love, botany. He is fascinated by climbing plants, by the power of movement in vines, by insect-eating plants like the sundew. He sees in them the same beautiful, intricate adaptations his theory predicted. He is reflective. His religious faith, which had been orthodox when he boarded the Beagle, has long since faded. He is not an atheist. He finds the term too aggressive. He settles on agnostic. He simply does not know. He sees the grandeur in the world, but he cannot reconcile it with the blind chance and wasteful cruelty of natural selection, or the personal tragedy of losing his beloved daughter, Annie, years before. His key relationship in this final chapter is with the earth itself. His final book, published in 1881, just before his death, is a testament to this. It is a book about earthworms. His last great work was The Formation of Vegetable Mold Through the Action of Worms. It was the culmination of over 40 years of observation. He had been studying worms since before he left on the Beagle. He had his sons play musical instruments to them. They were indifferent. He watched them pull leaves into their burrows. And he, most importantly, measured the rate at which they turn over the soil. His argument was pure Darwin. He took a small, slow, seemingly insignificant force, the earthworm, and, applying deep time, showed it to be a geological engine of immense power. He argued that all the vegetable mold over the whole country has passed many times through their bodies. He showed that worms were, in effect, the plows of the natural world, responsible for burying ancient ruins and shaping the landscape of England. It was a full circle. He was, once again, applying Lyell's uniformitarianism. He was showing how the grand is the product of the small, accumulated over eons. The book was an astonishing runaway bestseller. It sold thousands of copies, far more than The Origin had at first. The Sage of Down had, for his final act, made the humble earthworm the hero of its own geological epic. In the spring of 1882, his health, always fragile, began to fail. He had a series of heart seizures. He knew the end was near. He faced it with the same quiet, courage and stoic observation that had defined his life. On April 19, 1882, surrounded by his family at Down House, Charles Darwin died. He had wished to be buried in the quiet churchyard at Down, but his bulldog, Thomas Henry Huxley, and his other scientific allies would not have it. The Sage of Down, they argued, belonged to the nation. And so Charles Darwin, the agnostic, the revolutionary, the man who killed God, was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey. He was buried near the man whose book had started it all, Sir Isaac Newton. The establishment he had so feared, the world he had so profoundly unsettled, had, in the end, claimed him as one of its greatest heroes. Epilogue. The view from Down to walk the sandwalk at Down House today is to walk inside Darwin's mind. It is a path that goes in a circle, a place for pacing and thinking, a place where, lap after lap, the world was reimagined. Darwin's legacy is not just a theory, it is a method. It is a way of seeing. He taught us to see the world not as a product, but as a process. He taught us to look for the connections, not the divisions. He showed us that the most complex, beautiful, and even terrible things in life can arise from the simplest of laws, working over unimaginable stretches of time. His idea, natural selection, is the organizing principle of all modern biology. It is the foundation of medicine, ecology, and our understanding of our own human nature. But his legacy is also complicated. His theories, in the hands of others, were twisted into social Darwinism, a survival of the fittest ideology used to justify inequality, eugenics, and racial prejudice, ideas that Darwin himself, an ardent abolitionist, would have abhorred. He was a man of his time, and The Descent of Man contains passages that are, to our modern ears, products of a Victorian worldview. And yet, the core idea remains. It is perhaps the single most powerful idea ever conceived by a human mind. He gave us a new creation story. It is not a story of a fall, but a story of an ascent. It is a story that connects us intimately to the finch, the whale, the worm, and the bacterium. It makes us not the masters of nature, but a part of nature. Darwin ended his great book with a passage of profound secular beauty. He wrote it as one long argument, and it is fitting to end our journey with his words, as he reflected on the grandeur of this new view of life. It is interesting to contemplate an entangled bank, clothed with many plants of many kinds, with birds singing on the bushes, with various insects flitting about, and with worms crawling through the damp earth, that these elaborately constructed forms, so different from each other, and dependent on each other in so complex a manner, have all been produced by laws acting around us. Thus, from the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object which we are capable of conceiving, namely, the production of the higher animals, directly follows. There is grandeur in this view of life, that from so simple a beginning endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been, and are being, evolved. And so, with that grandeur in mind, the journey of Charles Darwin comes to a close. But the story he started, the endless forms, continues. Sleep well.